Miss Marple and the Ghost in the Old Mansion, Chapter 1, Afternoon. Tea turns bloody. The garden at Ashford Manor glowed in the gentle June sun, exactly as it should at St. Mary Mead during the summer season. Roses climbed the old grey stones, blue hydrangeas dotted the flower beds with colour, and round wicker tables were strategically placed beneath blue and white striped parasols. It was the kind of afternoon the English had perfected over centuries, perfectly temperate, luminous without being scorching, and filled with that unspoken promise that everything in the world was in its rightful place. Miss Jane Marple, a sprightly 83, observed all this from her seat by the table of homemade lemonade. She wore her finest printed cotton dress, lavender in colour, and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her kindly but perpetually watchful face. Around her, the cream of local society mingled in small groups. The vicar and his wife, the Weatherbys from the country house, Dr. Stevens, and of course, the hostess, Mrs. Constance Ashford. Mrs. Ashford was a 52-year-old widow with impeccably wavy silver hair, and the kind of self-assurance that only comes from generations of well-spent money. Her only son, Victor Ashford, was in his late 30s and worked in the city. Although according to the gossip at St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew all the gossiper's career had suffered some unexpected setbacks in recent months. His wife, the young and notoriously ungrateful Margot, was there too, wearing an ivory silk dress that must have cost more than the gardener's annual wages. What made this afternoon tea special, however, was the presence of Elizabeth Hartley. Miss Marple knew all the details about Elizabeth, of course. She was Mrs. Ashford's niece, the daughter of the younger sister who had married a Bohemian painter and moved to Paris 30 years ago. Elizabeth had arrived at St. Mary Mead a week earlier, somewhat unexpectedly, according to the village gossip. She was a young woman of about 25, with dark brown hair, grey eyes that seemed to see too much, and a smile that rarely reached them. She was wearing a simple black dress, even though it was June, which had already caused quite a stir in the shops and at the church. She must be in mourning, Mrs. Jenkins had speculated at the bakery. For a husband, perhaps, or a fiancé. No one knew for sure. Elizabeth had been somewhat evasive about the details of her life in France. Miss Marple was having her second bowl of chamomile tea when she noticed something interesting. Victor Ashford had just excused himself from his conversation with the vicar and had wandered off to the far end of the garden, where the manor house cast a long, cool shadow. Margot, his wife, had been talking to Dr. Stevens, but her eyes followed her husband as he moved. And then this was what really caught Miss Marple's attention. Elizabeth Hartley got up from the desert table, and a few minutes later, she too disappeared in the direction of the garden. 3 minutes later, Margot Ashford excused her absence with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and also left. Miss Marple contemplated her teacup with an expression of scholarly interest. In her experience, choreographed movements like these were seldom accidental, but still, it was nothing to warrant alarm. People made excuses from social events all the time, though, she thought, not normally in that particular sequence, as if they were chapters of a drama unfolding according to a rehearsed script. The afternoon continued with that languid air, typical of English garden parties. More cups of tea, a few cucumber sandwiches that quickly disappeared, a conversation about the vicar's rose bushes. Mrs. Weatherby was telling a long and intricate anecdote about her grandson at Oxford. Time passed with that timeless quality that 3 o'clock social gatherings possess. It was around 4:30 when the gardener, old Tom, hurried into the garden. He wasn't exactly running men. Of his age and experience, never ran at social functions, but his pace was noticeably faster than conventions normally. Aloud, he went straight to Mrs. Ashford and whispered something in her ear. The change in Mrs. Ashford's face was instantaneous and complete. Her serene hostess expression froze, then dissolved. The color drained from her cheeks. "Oh," he said, and it was neither a question nor an exclamation, but something in between. "Oh, my God." She stood up, her teacup falling onto the grass without spilling, though no one seemed to particularly notice. The garden, which had been filled with that polite but disjointed cordiality of well-organized social events, shifted in atmosphere. Groups dispersed. Heads turned. Questions began to be murmured. Miss Marple saw Mrs. Ashford heading towards the house, with old Tom anxiously following behind. She saw Margot Ashford reappear from among the plants, her face pale. She saw Victor emerge from the garden a few moments later, adjusting his cravat with careful deliberation. And then, finally, she saw Elizabeth Hartley slowly returning, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her grey eyes more watchful and circumspect than ever. "I think something terrible has happened," Dr. Stevens said to Miss Marple in a low voice. "Have you seen how Mrs. Ashford is?" "I saw it," confirmed Miss Marple, her voice as calm as ever. Her eyes, however, had not left the house. 5 minutes later, when the police were finally called, they discovered what old Tom had uncovered while cleaning the flower beds behind the house: the body of Mr. Roland Ashford, a distant cousin of the family, who had been visiting the mansion for a week. He had been brutally struck on the head with what appeared to be a heavy gardening tool, and he was, without a doubt, dead. The June afternoon, with all its promise of English perfection, had frozen in an instant of horror. Chapter 2. The people whisper their theories. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed of a summer fire, that is to say, with extraordinary rapidity. Within 2 hours, every resident of the village knew that Roland Ashford was dead. Within 3 hours, most had a theory about who had killed him and why. Within 4 hours, the theory had transformed into absolute certainty, at least in the minds of those who held it. The local police had cordoned off the end of Ashford's garden with yellow and black tape. Detective Inspector Charles Mallory, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed mustache and the mannerisms of someone accustomed to solving crimes in rural villages where the crimes were typically prosaic and predictable, had begun his initial interviews. The village telephone, which was essentially any shop where more than one person could gather, rang incessantly. The news was shared, spread, and transformed. Miss Marple, of course, learned about most of the theories before sunset turned into nightfall. She went to the corner store to buy thread for her. Embroidery, elegant but honest pretext. Since she really did need sky blue, thread, and was greeted by Mrs. Baker, who was practically vibrating with conspiratorial enthusiasm. "How terrible, absolutely terrible," exclaimed Mrs. Baker, carefully wrapping 2 spools of thread in craft paper. "Although, if you ask me, it's not entirely surprising. Mr. Roland was always a man, well, let's say, of questionable habits." "Really?" asked Miss Marple in her usual tone of genuine interest. "What exactly do you mean?" "Well," Mrs. Baker lowered her voice, though the shop was essentially empty apart from Mrs. Patterson, who was pretending to examine the hair ribbons with a dedication that suggested she was actually listening to every word. "He was known to have had some trouble with money. Other people's money, if you know what I mean. There was something about valuables going missing from a house where he was staying a few years ago. Nothing was ever proven, of course, but people talk. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, people always talked, and not always accurately. Then there was Mrs. Weatherby's theory, who had come especially to Miss Marple's house after Vespers to discuss the matter properly. According to Mrs. Weatherby, Roland Ashford had been blatantly flirting with Margot Ashford throughout the visit, which of course would have infuriated Victor. Jealousy. My dear Miss Marple, jealousy is a terrible motive, declared Mrs. Weatherby from the drawing-room sofa, her fingers nervously knitting. I've seen marriages destroyed over less, and that Victor has always had a, let's say, volatile temper. Miss Marple offered tea and listened patiently as Mrs. Weatherby elaborated on a whole scenario in which Victor, in a fit of marital rage, had struck his cousin with a garden spade. It was a coherent theory, superficially. Except, thought Miss Marple as she poured the tea, that men who commit crimes of passion tend to do so in the heat of the moment, not after politely excusing themselves from a social event and making their way to the garden in such a deliberately casual manner. Then there was the most intriguing theory, the one circulating among the waiters and staff of the mansion, that Elizabeth Hartley, the mysterious niece from Paris, was actually the culprit. No one knew exactly why speculation ranged from Roland Ashford owing her money to her secretly hating him over some unspecified incident in France, but the fact that she was an outsider, that she dressed in black, that she had eyes that saw too much, as the maid Sally had said, in a voice that suggested she understood the dark mysteries of the human heart, made her the perfect suspect in the local tavern, of course. The speculation was even more florid. Mr. Henricott, the owner, had mentioned with all the certainty of someone who knew absolutely nothing that it was probably an accident. Perhaps Roland had been examining the gardening tools and simply tripped and hit his head. This was quickly dismissed by almost everyone, although some seemed to find the idea comforting. An accident was far less disturbing than premeditated murder. Dr. Whitmore, when consulted by Miss Marple during a morning visit the next day she needed tonics, naturally was more practical. Head wounds are particularly treacherous, he explained, handing her a small bottle of amber-colored liquid. The object used was heavy, that much is clear. A gardening tool, probably, though it could be many things. The important thing is that the attacker must have been covered in blood. It's practically impossible to hit someone in the head with that much force without splashing. This was a useful detail that Miss Marple mentally filed away, though she didn't mention it to the doctor. Nor did she mention that she had noticed, while the police were making their first rounds, that Margot Ashford was wearing a different dress when they arrived at the mansion, even though her previous ivory silk gown had been impeccably clean. Interesting, though not necessarily significant. People changed their clothes for all sorts of reasons. What Miss Marple found even more interesting was Victor Ashford's behavior. He had seemed surprised when the death was revealed, naturally. But there was something in the way his eyes had moved to Margot, then to Elizabeth, in that split second before allowing proper surprise to take hold of his face, which suggested that the surprise he displayed might have been partly acted. And then there was Elizabeth Hartley, who didn't seem surprised at all. Miss Marple had learned over her 83 years that people innocent of a crime typically experienced at least a momentary shock when a murder was revealed, even if they hadn't known the victim particularly well. It was a visceral reaction to violence, to transgression. But Elizabeth, when old Tom had cried for help, had simply closed her eyes for a moment, as if confirming something she already knew. That, thought Miss Marple, as she sat with her embroidery that evening, was particularly interesting in a girl who was supposed to have only arrived at St. Mary Mead a week ago, as she worked tiny, sky-blue dots on a white canvas. Miss Marple reflected on what her years of observation had taught her, that small towns like St. Mary Mead were in fact entire universes in miniature. They contained the full spectrum of human passions, moral codes, secrets, and lies, and, disturbingly often, murder. The town's theory was that Victor Ashford had committed the crime in a fit of jealousy. The police, Miss Marple suspected, would be inclined to agree. She had everything they wanted: a clear motive, a ready suspect, a case that could be closed. But Miss Marple, as her knitting needles moved rhythmically, wasn't convinced. She never was, at least not until all the pieces fit together perfectly. And these pieces, for the moment, were still whizzing off in unknown directions, waiting to find their place. The real killer, he suspected, was walking freely around St. Mary Mead, perhaps even visiting the shops, buying milk or tea, feigning surprise with the same care as one would feign any other emotion. Chapter 3. The police investigation takes shape. Inspector Mallory had established his temporary base of operations in the library of Ashford Manor, a high-ceilinged room with walls lined with books that looked as if they hadn't been opened in decades. A dark mahogany table, normally used for writing correspondence, now held scattered notes, an open notebook, and a gradually cooling cup of tea. The inspector, with his neatly trimmed moustache and his greyish-blue eyes that seemed to have seen too many routine cases in overly respectable towns, was beginning to resemble a slightly frustrated man. It was 9 o'clock in the morning of the second day after the body was discovered. Roland Ashford's body had been taken to the morgue in the neighbouring town the previous afternoon, and Dr. Whitmore had provided a preliminary report. Death caused by severe head trauma, probably inflicted with a blunt object consistent with a heavy gardening tool. The time of death was estimated to be between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, which corresponded fairly well with the time old Tom had discovered the body around 4:30. What Inspector Mallory didn't know was exactly who had held that gardening tool. Mr. Victor Ashford admits to leaving the social event at about 3:15, read Sergeant Morrison aloud, who was standing by the window with his own notebook. Morrison was a younger man, with that kind of contained energy that suggested he considered a promotion to inspector his immediate right. He says he needed to escape the crowd, that he was tired of the socializing. He walked to the far end of the garden, where there are some stone benches beside the flower beds. Did anyone see it? Mallory asked. No, sir. Or at least, no one has confirmed it. Mrs. Weatherby believes she saw him heading in that direction, but she's not sure of the exact time. Mallory grunted, which was his way of expressing academic skepticism. And what does it say about their clothes? Is there blood? We inspected his suit when we arrived at the house. It was completely clean, sir, even his hands. He said he had washed when he returned to the house about an hour after leaving, that he wanted to freshen up. Convenient, Mallory murmured. And Mrs. Margot Ashford? Morrison changed the subject. He also admits to having excused himself from the event. He says he went inside the house to use the bathroom. It was around 3:20. He was inside for approximately 30 minutes. When he came out, he allegedly went directly to speak with Dr. Stevens. And does Dr. Stevens confirm it? Partially, sir. She says Mrs. Margot approached her at about 3:50, but she admits she wasn't paying exact attention to the time. It could have been earlier. She doesn't know for sure. Mallory leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. So we have Victor leaving the group with no reliable witnesses, and Margot disappearing inland without a clear timeline. They both have access to gardening tools. They both had the opportunity. Yes, sir. Although the reason is stronger for Victor. The matter of jealousy with Mrs. Margot. Has anything been confirmed about that? Morrison hesitated. Well, not exactly, sir. Several villagers have mentioned it. They say Roland was being particularly attentive to Mrs. Margot, but Mrs. Margot herself denies it. She says Roland was polite, nothing more. And Victor says he trusts his wife completely. Mallory pondered this. In her experience, when a husband said he trusted his wife completely immediately after a murder, it usually meant he didn't trust her at all. And the niece, Elizabeth Hartley. Ah, yes. That's interesting, sir. Morrison consulted his notes with renewed enthusiasm. She also admits to having excused herself from the event. She says she went for a walk in the garden, finding the crowd suffocating. She entered the mansion around 3:30 to refresh herself in her room. She was out of the event for approximately 40 minutes. Did anyone see her? No, sir. No one in particular. Mallory drummed his fingers on the table. And what is your relationship with the late Roland Ashford? Did you know him before? Apparently not, sir. She says it's the first time she's met you. She only arrived in St. Mary Mead about a week ago from France, where she's been living. She hasn't been in contact with the Ashford family for several years. And did she visit France? No, sir. Not that we know of. Mallory got up and walked to the window, where he could see the garden where the body had been discovered. The morning light made everything seem serene, almost immaculate, as if the crime had been merely a restless dream of the estate. We have 3 prime suspects, he said slowly. Victor Ashford, who has the apparent motive of jealousy, although his lack of blood on his clothing is troubling. Margot Ashford, whose schedule is vague and whose relationship to the victim is questionable according to rumors. And Elizabeth Hartley, an outsider about whom we know very little, except that she disappeared without witnesses during the relevant time. We also have to consider the staff, Morrison suggested. Old Tom the gardener had access to the tools, and there were other servants in the house. Old Tom has worked for the Ashford family for 30 years without incident. It's unlikely he's just started murdering family members now. But yes, we will check the staff. Mallory returned to his desk and sat down heavily. Good. Here's what we'll do. We'll send the gardening tool when we find it, assuming it's on the property for analysis. We'll check the clothing of all our suspects more carefully. And we'll talk to each of them again separately, this time looking for inconsistencies. And Miss Marple, sir? Morrison asked in a tone that suggested he was being condescending. Mallory raised an eyebrow. What about Miss Marple? Well, sir, some of the villagers mentioned that you were at the event. And well, you have a reputation for noticing things, for solving mysteries. Mallory snorted. Miss Marple is a retired old woman who lives in a cottage and enjoys gossip. That doesn't make her an investigator, Morrison. However, he added, thinking of his own limitations as an investigator in a village, where apparently half the population could testify about the movements of the other half. Even if neither was truly certain, it might be worth speaking to her about her observations of the event. Sometimes insignificant details tell more than obvious facts. Morrison nodded. Noting this down, what neither of the two men knew was that Miss Morrison, at that very moment, was in the widow Jenkins's convalescent home, enjoying tea and biscuit, and had noticed something very specific about the answers Margot Ashford had given to the police questions. When they had visited the widow Jenkins the day before, Miss Marple had heard the conversation clearly. Their walls of English villages were notoriously thin, and widow Jenkins had not completely closed the drawing room. Dorand had registered a small but significant inconsistency in what Margot had said about where she had been. It wasn't much, but it was enough, and Miss Marple, as she took another sip of tea and delicately bit into her biscuit, began to weave together the threads of what she knew with the threads of what the people thought they knew, searching for the pattern that lay beneath it all. Chapter 4. The suspects revealed Dashford Manor had taken on a different quality under police scrutiny. The curtains remained partially drawn, as if the house itself were ashamed of its murdered secret. The servants moved with more cautious steps, their whispered conversations ceasing when someone approached. Mrs. Ashford, who had acted as the perfect hostess just 2 days before, now looked like an aged woman, her hands trembling as she poured tea into Inspector Mallory's glass in the library. "It's absolutely unthinkable," she said for the third time, her fingers twisting in her lap. Roland was a member of the family. Yes, there were. Well, there were certain financial matters that were never fully resolved, but that was years ago. Absolutely years ago. Mallory, who was taking meticulous notes in his notebook, looked up. "Financial matters, Mrs. Ashford." Mrs. Ashford hesitated, clearly debating with herself how much to reveal. It was 1932. Roland was visiting a distant cousin in Surrey. Some valuables went missing from the house. It was never proven that Roland had taken them, of course, but there were suspicions. The family never spoke of it publicly, and yet she allowed him to visit her home. "It was Constance's idea," said Mrs. Ashford, referring to her. "She was always the kindest to him. She believed in redemption. She thought that after all these years, we all deserved to put the past behind us." Mallory noted this. Kindness, in his experience, rarely solved the problems arising from dishonesty. It usually merely prolonged them. As Mrs. Ashford retired to her room, looking gaunt, Victor Ashford was summoned to the library. Victor was a man who seemed to fit perfectly into a Savile Row suit, though his eyes betrayed a restlessness that his expensive clothes couldn't disguise. He sat upright, his posture impeccable, his hands resting carefully on his knees. "Inspector," he began, his voice controlled, "I expect this to be resolved quickly. Business in the city doesn't stop while the police investigate crimes in rural towns. A man has been murdered." "Mr. Ashford," Mallory replied, with the tone of someone who had heard too many misaligned priorities. "Business can probably wait." Victor blushed slightly. "Of course. I'm sorry. It's just that the situation is ... disturbing. Tell me more about your relationship with Roland. Were you close?" "We knew each other, obviously, but not frequently. Our lives have taken very different paths. He's had, let's say, difficulties in his businesses. I've been more fortunate. Do you know anything about these difficulties?" Victor leaned forward slightly. Roland was always looking for money. Loans, investments, anything that could provide him with quick funds. It's a pattern the family has recognized for a long time. It's unfortunate. And what was his relationship with his wife like? Victor blinked. "With Margot? Excellent. We're very happy together." Why do you ask? Just to set the facts. Mr. Ashford, I've heard some rumors that Roland was being particularly attentive to Mrs. Ashford. Rumors, Victor said with a coolness that suggested the rumors had been heard and thoroughly processed. In towns like this, there are always rumors. Roland was a polite man, polite when it came to women. Nothing more. Margot is my wife, and I trust her completely. He said it so directly, so without a note of doubt, that Mallory knew at that moment it was a lie. Not a lie about trust necessarily, but a statement so overemphasized that it suggested the truth was considerably more complicated. When Victor was dispatched, Margot was called. Margot Ashford wore a different dress than the one she had worn to the tea party. This one was a pale green, more appropriate for a woman whose husband was under suspicion of murder. Her face was carefully made up, but her eyes had a glimmer that suggested recent tears, though that could have simply been from applying eye drops. She sat with the grace of someone accustomed to being watched. I must say, Inspector, this situation is absolutely heartbreaking, he began, before Mallory could speak. Roland was unpleasant, certainly, but he didn't deserve. Well, this... Unpleasant in what way, Mrs. Ashford? Margot hesitated, as if considering how much to reveal. He had, shall we say, certain annoying habits. He was the kind of man who would stare when he thought no one was watching, and he touched too much. An arm here, a hand there. Nothing that could be precisely accused, but unpleasant. He made me uncomfortable several times. And did her husband know? I suspect so, Margot said carefully. Although he didn't mention it directly. Where exactly were you during the tea party when Roland was killed? I went inside the house. The heat was getting to me, and I needed to cool down. I went to my room, had some cold water, and then went back to the event. Are there any witnesses to this? None that I specifically remember, Margot admitted. I walked through the corridors, but they were pretty empty at that time. Most people were in the garden. Mallory asked her several more questions, but received few satisfactory answers. Margot seemed simultaneously anxious and controlled, as if she were carefully navigating the words she chose. Finally, Elizabeth Hartley was called. Elizabeth entered the library with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. She sat down uninvited, her posture upright, her eyes fixed on Mallory with an intensity that the inspector found slightly unsettling. I understand you were at the tea event, Mallory began. Briefly, Elizabeth confirmed. I found the atmosphere stifling. Too many people, too much gossip. I decided to take a walk in the garden, and then I went into my room to rest. And you didn't see anything unusual? Didn't you hear anything? Elizabeth considered the question. I heard voices at some point. 2 people arguing, I think, though I couldn't make out the words. It was when I was inside my room. Could you describe these voices? One was a man's, that's for sure. The other, less certain. It could have been another male voice or a deeper female voice. They were annoyed with each other. That much was clear. Mallory bowed his head, and he didn't investigate. It didn't seem like any of my business, Elizabeth said simply. Mallory scribbled notes. There was something about her she couldn't quite put her finger on. A lack of surprise about the murder. A composure that seemed almost practiced, and a way of speaking that suggested she knew far more than she was letting on. When Elizabeth was excused, Mallory sat in the quiet library, his notes scattered before him. 3 suspects. 3 stories that didn't quite connect. and a growing sense that the truth lay somewhere in the cracks of what had been said. What he didn't know was that Miss Marple, meanwhile, had reached considerably more accurate conclusions, and the key piece, thought Miss Marple as she examined a small detail she had noticed during the tea event itself, was something that no one else seemed to have noticed at all. Chapter 5. A clue in the shadows. Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Mallory in her small sitting room on Thursday morning, exactly when she had expected him to arrive. Men like Mallory, though skeptical of the value of an old woman's perspective, eventually came to the conclusion that all information was potentially useful. She had brewed the finest tea and baked fresh shortbread, which never hurt when it came to cooperating with the police. "It's very kind of you to see me, Miss Marple," Mallory began, sitting down in the straight-backed chair she had indicated. "I understand you were present at the tea party when the murder occurred." "That's right," confirmed Miss Marple, pouring the tea with perfectly steady hands. "A very tragic afternoon. Roland Ashford was never a particularly pleasant man, but still, it was a violent end." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "Did I know him?" "Not personally. But St. Mary Mead is a small town, Inspector. You hear things. Gossip is, in a sense, the currency of a town like this. It usually contains at least a kernel of truth. And what gossip have you heard about Roland Ashford?" Miss Marple took a delicate sip of her tea. "That he was constantly in financial difficulties. That there was an incident years ago in Surrey that was never fully resolved. And, more recently, that his manners towards women were somewhat inappropriate, although the latter could simply be people's interpretation of his behavior." Mallory nodded, taking notes. "And during the event itself, did you notice anything unusual?" Here, Miss Marple paused deliberately. She had been thinking about this question ever since the body was discovered. In fact, she had been thinking about a number of small details which she had made sure to record mentally, knowing that with age, details could scatter like sand through one's fingers. "Several movements struck me as noteworthy," he began slowly. "First, Mr. Victor Ashford excused himself from the group at about 3:15. He went toward the far end of the garden, where there is a stone bench under a linden tree. About 5 minutes later, Miss Elizabeth Hartley also excused herself and went in the same general direction. And then, a few minutes after that, Mrs. Margot Ashford got up from the table and went into the house." "Did you see Victor and Elizabeth together?" Mallory asked, leaning forward. "No, Inspector. They didn't see the other one leave. They left at separate times, and each seemed to be pursuing their own purpose. What was interesting was the sequence. It was quite deliberate, quite choreographed, so to speak." Mallory wrote this in a fit of rage. "And what is this trying to suggest, Miss Marple?" "Only what I observed, Inspector. Nothing more. Although, if I may make a rather personal observation, the way Mrs. Margot looked at Mr. Victor as he left suggested a concern that went beyond what one would expect if it was simply normal social conversation." "Do you think Mrs. Ashford was jealous of Mr. Ashford?" "I think it's possible Mrs. Ashford was worried about something," Miss Marple corrected. "The exact nature of that worry remains open to speculation." Mallory continued with her questions, but Miss Marple sensed that her mind had wandered to other matters. When she finally rose to leave, she mentioned one more thing. "Inspector, may I make a suggestion? There may be merit in examining Mr. Ashford's hands with particular care, and also, perhaps, in asking Dr. Whitmore whether the weapon used would have required considerable strength from someone of, let's say, a lighter build." Mallory stopped in the doorway. Are you suggesting that a woman committed the crime? I am suggesting, Inspector, that the force required to inflict such an injury is something that deserves special consideration. To my knowledge, Mr. Ashford was a man of considerable weight, and the head is a difficult location for someone significantly shorter to reach effectively. That is all. After Mallory left, Miss Marple sat in her usual chair by the window with her needlework. Her needles moved rhythmically as her mind worked through the threads of the case. What she had failed to tell the inspector was something she had observed with particular care. During the tea party, she had noticed a small detail about Margot Ashford's clothing that seemed significant now, in retrospect. A loose thread in the seam of her left sleeve cuff, as if the seam had been subjected to unusual tension. And later, when Margot had returned from inside the house, she was wearing a different sleeve, a different cuff. Not the same ivory silk dress. Miss Marple hadn't commented on this because she was considering its implications. A woman changing her clothes during a social event was unusual but not incriminating. A woman changing her clothes after what might have been an act of violence was far more significant. What Miss Marple was also considering was the question of why. Exactly, Mrs. Margot Ashford would have been motivated to murder her cousin-in-law. For, she thought as her needle pierced the canvas, the jealousy story didn't hold up if one examined the available evidence. Victor Ashford didn't seem like a man consumed by jealousy. In fact, he seemed like a man preoccupied with something entirely different, which led Miss Marple to a more interesting question. What if the motive wasn't about Victor at all? What if the motive was rooted in something Roland Ashford knew about Margot, or something he was planning to do? Miss Marple pondered Mrs. Ashford's mention of Roland's financial affairs, the missing assets, the unsolved incident of 1932, a family that had chosen to forgive, or at least excuse, because kindness was more important than truth. But what if Roland Ashford wasn't just an occasional thief? What if his visit to St. Mary Mead was motivated by something more recent? Something related to the current Ashford family? Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate a specific matter. She would visit the family lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, who handled the affairs of the Ashford estate. He was a man who would surely know if there had been any recent transactions, any changes to the documents, anything that might have prompted an urgent visit from a relative in need, because in Miss Marple's experience, when money was involved, most other motives paled in comparison, and a woman, especially a woman whose financial security was threatened, might commit acts that would otherwise be unimaginable. Miss Marple's needle continued to pierce the canvas as the afternoon slipped into evening. Outside, St. Mary Mead carried on with her ordinary life, unaware that an old woman in a village house was methodically and with a precision that would have impressed even Inspector Mallory, unraveling the perfect crime before its true nature could be completely concealed. Chapter 6. Financial Secrets Revealed. Pemberton, the Ashford family solicitor for 32 years, worked in an office crammed with legal documents that smelled of old dust and furniture polish. He was a 70-year-old man with steel-rimmed glasses and a voice that seemed to have been honed through decades of professional discretion. When Miss Marple entered his office on Friday morning, under the convenient pretext that she needed to review her own will, which was partly true, Mr. Pemberton was delighted to receive her. Miss Marple. What a pleasure, he greeted, rising from his desk. Although I must confess a certain surprise. Your will was only revised 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. That's true, Miss Marple confirmed, sitting down carefully. But in light of recent events at St. Mary Mead, I thought it prudent to make sure everything is in order." Mr. Pemberton nodded sympathetically. He was the kind of lawyer who understood that murders made people reflect on their own mortality. A very sensible thought. "I'll gladly review your papers. But first, allow me to offer you some tea. I believe my secretary has just brewed a pot." While Mr. Pemberton made the arrangements, Miss Marple let her gaze wander around the office. The lawyer's desk was covered with stacks of files, many of which bore names she recognized. From St. Mary Mead, a filing cabinet in the corner appeared to have a label that read Ashford Correspondence. It was the kind of detail that less observant investigators might have missed. When the tea was served and Mr. Pemberton had settled himself back into his leather chair, Miss Marple allowed herself a casual remark. "I've heard that Mr. Roland Ashford has been visiting the mansion recently," he mentioned. "A distant relative, if I'm not mistaken." Mr. Pemberton's expression became slightly more cautious. "Indeed, a relative from the collateral branch of the family. He died under very tragic circumstances, as you no doubt know." "Yes, very tragic. Although I understand he had some rather complicated financial matters." Mr. Pemberton hesitated visibly. In the hands of someone less experienced, it would have been an obvious gesture. But Miss Marple had learned to read these micro-movements of uncertainty through 83 years of human observation. "I don't know exactly what he's heard," the lawyer said cautiously. "But it's true that Mr. Roland Ashford has experienced some financial setbacks over the years. Matters of poor investing, mainly. And was your recent visit to ask for financial assistance?" Miss Marple asked flatly. Mr. Pemberton adjusted his glasses. "Miss Marple, I must maintain confidentiality regarding my client's affairs." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Although, considering that Roland Ashford is now deceased and his death is under police investigation, one might argue that certain details could be relevant in determining its cause." Mr. Pemberton leaned back in his chair, which emitted a groan of protest. "I suppose you have a valid point. However, the specific details of any financial agreement remain between the deceased and my living client." "I understand perfectly," said Miss Marple. "But perhaps I could answer a more general question. Did Mr. Roland Ashford go to Ashford Manor to ask for a loan?" The lawyer chose his words carefully. Mr. Roland Ashford visited the Ashford family for multiple purposes. Some of those purposes were financial in nature, others were not. And were these financial matters resolved? Mr. Pemberton took off his glasses and cleaned them on his handkerchief, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as a delaying tactic. "Not entirely," she finally admitted. "There was some friction over the terms of any potential arrangement between whom and Mr. Roland Ashford. I cannot reveal that without betraying client confidentiality," Mr. Pemberton said firmly. But what he didn't say, what his expression revealed very clearly, was that the friction hadn't been between Roland and Victor Ashford. It had been between Roland and someone else. Miss Marple mentally filled in the gap. The only other person who would have authority over the family's financial affairs would be Margot. If the documents were under her control, or possibly Mrs. Ashford herself, the family matriarch. "One more question," said Miss Marple gently. "Is there a prenuptial agreement between Mr. Victor Ashford and Mrs. Margot Ashford?" Mr. Pemberton blinked. "Pardon? It's a simple question. Mr. Pemberton, is there a prenuptial agreement that details the division of assets in the event of a divorce?" Mr. Pemberton put his glasses back on. "Now then, Miss Marple, I think you're being more cunning than you let on." Such arrangements are matters entirely confidential between my clients and myself. Of course, Miss Marple agreed. Although I understand that prenuptial agreements are not uncommon in families of considerable financial means, and that such agreements often depend on the marriage remaining intact. Mr. Pemberton rose abruptly, which Miss Marple interpreted as a sign that the interview had reached its productive end. Miss Marple, I believe we have reached the limits of what I can discuss. Now, if you wish to review your will, I am happy to do so. But as for the matters of the Ashford family, that is territory I cannot navigate with you. Of course, said Miss Marple, rising with her usual grace. You have been more than generous with your time. Mr. Pemberton, as she left the lawyer's office, Miss Marple had stitched 2 and 2 together in her mind, and they were clearly making a 4. Roland Ashford had come to St. Mary Mead not simply to ask for money. He had come to make a claim regarding some financial matter related to the marriage of Victor and Margot Ashford, and that claim had been serious enough that someone in the family felt it best to keep it permanently quiet. But what exactly was the nature of the claim? Had Roland discovered something in the financial records? Something that would jeopardize Margot's marriage? Or something that would compromise his access to the family funds? Miss Marple walked slowly back towards the village, her steps measured, her mind working through the details. If Margot believed her financial security was threatened by Roland Ashford, if he possessed information that could result in a prenuptial agreement being invoked, then she would have a very real and very powerful motive, and a woman with her future security at stake might be capable of things that would otherwise be completely out of character for her. What Miss Marple still needed to discover was exactly what kind of information Roland had possessed, and how exactly Margot had discovered that he was prepared to reveal it. But that, thought Miss Marple as she stopped to allow a car to pass, could be determined by a very careful question to Inspector Mallory about what Mr. Roland Ashford had brought with him when he arrived at St. Mary Mead, because in her experience, men who came with damning information usually carried some evidence of it, and that evidence, Miss Marple suspected, might reveal exactly what dark secret had cost Roland Ashford his life. Chapter 7. The Lost Diary. Inspector Mallory was in the library at Ashford Manor when Miss Marple summoned him on Saturday morning. She had been examining the inventory of belongings Roland Ashford had left in his guest room, a depressingly small collection of items that suggested a life of constant moving from one house to another. Miss Marple, he greeted, rising from his chair. I hope you're well. Is there anything I can help you with? On the contrary, Inspector, I believe I may be able to help you, replied Miss Marple, taking a seat without being invited, an act of familiarity that indicated the seriousness of her purpose. I have been reflecting on the nature of this crime, and I have come to the conclusion that the motive is fundamentally financial. Mallory bowed his head. Go on. Mr. Roland Ashford came to St. Mary Mead, not simply to visit the family, but with a specific purpose connected with money, Miss Marple explained. I have no direct evidence of this, of course, but the snatches of conversation I have gathered in the village, combined with what I know about Mr. Roland Ashford's past, suggest that he had made a claim directly affecting the financial security of at least one member of this family. And what is this complaint? Asked Mallory, her eyes focusing on Miss Marple with renewed interest. That's where your investigation should focus, Inspector. What did Mr. Ashford bring with him when he arrived? Documents? Letters? Anything that might contain evidence of this claim? Mallory turned to a side desk where several cardboard boxes lay. His belongings were catalogued when the police arrived. mostly clothing, some toiletries, and a relatively small amount of cash. But there's this, he said, pulling out a small brown leather journal, which was found in his suitcase. It's mainly an expense record, though there are a few personal notes. He handed the diary to Miss Marple, who examined it carefully. The first few pages did indeed contain what appeared to be a record of money spent. Railway from London to St. Mary Mead. Lodging, meals. But as she turned the pages, the entries became more substantial. June 12th, VS letter rejected. It says there are no funds, but I saw the bank statements. There are funds. There's a lot of money. Where is it going? You must speak to M directly. June 15th. M denies responsibility. She says everything is under V's control, but her signature is on the documents. I've seen the documents. She's lying, or she's doing it deliberately. June 18th. I've found the truth. The funds are being transferred, not by V, but by M herself. Small amounts, regularly, for months. Where are they going? It must be for something. It must be for someone. A lover, perhaps, or a debt. I must speak with the lawyer. Miss Marple looked up from her newspaper. Has Inspector Mallory seen this? We found it recently, Mallory admitted. I've been debating its relevance. These notes are vague. It could be referring to anything. But you do know, however, that Mr. Roland Ashford believed he had discovered something significant. Asked Miss Marple gently. Possibly, Mallory conceded. Have you investigated whether Miss Margot Ashford is, in fact, making unusual financial transfers? Mallory hesitated. Not directly. Although we have spoken with Mr. Ashford about the family business, and he didn't mention anything of this kind. It's possible he doesn't know, Miss Marple suggested, especially if the transfers were disguised in some way, or if they were made from an account under his control but whose records he rarely checks. Mallory stood up and walked to the window. Are you suggesting that Mrs. Margot Ashford was stealing money from the family? I am suggesting that Mr. Roland Ashford believed he had discovered her in some sort of improper financial transaction, Miss Marple corrected. What sort of transaction, exactly, has yet to be determined. But if Mrs. Ashford knew that he had this information, if she feared that he would reveal it to Mr. Victor Ashford or the family solicitor, then she would have had a very strong motive, strong enough to kill him. Inspector, in my experience, people murder for far less substantial reasons than a threat to their own financial and marital security, said Miss Marple. Women, in particular, often have fewer choices in life than men. If Mrs. Margot Ashford is being treated unfairly financially, if her funds are being controlled by someone else, if her only access to independence is being threatened by the exposure of her activities, then the crime begins to look less like an act of passion and more like an act of desperation. Mallory returned to her chair. But where's the evidence that it was her? We have 3 suspects, all without entirely solid alibis. Victor could have done this in a fit of rage. Elizabeth Hartley has no known connection to Roland, but neither do we have any witnesses to his whereabouts. And Margot changed her clothes, Miss Marple interrupted calmly. After the tea party. I'm sure, if you search her room, you'll find the dress she wore during the party. That dress, especially if it was roughly worn, should show some evidence of blood. Even if it was washed, modern tests could detect it. Mallory sat up. How do you know I changed my clothes? Because, Miss Marple explained, I noticed a loose thread on her left sleeve during the event. It was a very small detail, hardly noticeable. But when she returned to the garden later, that thread was gone. The seam had either been mended or the dress had been changed. Given the brevity of time, it was more likely that the dress had been changed. And why didn't you mention this when I spoke with you? Because I wasn't sure of its meaning at the time, Miss Marple answered honestly. It required the context of the wider investigation. Now, however, combined with what we've discovered about Mrs. Ashford's financial affairs, the pattern is beginning to look clear. Mallory stood up and rang the bell on the wall. Sergeant Morrison appeared moments later. "Sir," he asked. "Take 2 men to Mrs. Margot Ashford's room," Mallory ordered. "Look for an ivory silk dress, specifically one that was worn during the tea party on Tuesday, and look carefully for any evidence of damage or attempted cleaning. Keep the room secured until I can examine it personally." After Morrison left, Mallory turned to Miss Marple. "If you're right about this, Miss Marple, if we find blood on that dress, then we'll have our case." "It won't be a pretty case," Miss Marple observed. "Mrs. Ashford is a woman who acted under considerable pressure. But yes, Inspector, I believe it will be your case." Mallory studied the old woman before him. With her serene expression and eyes that seemed to have seen every possible variation of human weakness. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. Have you ever considered working with the police? I could use someone with your observational skills." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I'm too old for new careers, Inspector, but I'm happy to be of use from time to time." What she didn't say was that she was already solving crimes. She had been doing so for years, just in a more discreet manner. St. Mary Mead had her own methods of justice, some of which would never be formalized in police records. But this time, Miss Marple thought, as she prepared to leave, formal police action would be necessary. Chapter 8. The Truth Under Pressure. Margot Ashford's room was decorated with the touches of someone whose life had been defined by elegance and material comfort. The walls were painted a soft cream, the curtains were white damask, and the furniture was polished mahogany. But it was the built-in wardrobe that revealed the evidence Inspector Mallory was looking for. The ivory silk dress, hung among other chiffon and linen gowns, seemingly indistinguishable. But when it was carefully removed from the wardrobe and examined under strong light, the dark bloodstains were immediately visible. They weren't extensive, which explained why the change of clothes had been enough to fool casual observers. But they were there, clearly present, on the left sleeve and cuff. Exactly where Miss Marple had predicted. What was even more incriminating was the discovery of a second cloth in the room's wastebasket, one that had been recently wet and appeared to contain traces of blood that had been hastily washed away. "Inspector," Mallory ordered the dress to be packaged as evidence and then went to find Margot Ashford was in the living room, embroidering with seemingly complete concentration. When Mallory entered, she looked up with a questioning expression that almost seemed genuine. "Mrs. Ashford," Mallory began, without preamble, "I need you to accompany me to my temporary office. I have some additional questions about your activities on Tuesday." The embroidery slipped from Margot's hands. Her face paled visibly. "Questions? I thought I'd already answered all your questions, Inspector." "Perhaps not all," Mallory replied. "If you would be so kind." What happened in the library during the next 2 hours was a lesson in the fragility of well-constructed lies when confronted with physical evidence. Initially, Margot tried to stick to her story. She had gone inside the house to freshen up. She hadn't seen Roland Ashford. She didn't know how the blood had gotten on her dress. But when Mallory presented him with the preliminary analysis, which indicated that the blood on his clothes matched Mr. Roland Ashford's blood type, his composure began to crack. It could have happened accidentally, she suggested weakly. When I returned to the event, perhaps I touched him. Perhaps he had been injured in some way that I didn't know about. Mr. Ashford was brutally struck on the head with enough force to cause death. Mrs. Ashford, Mallory said. It wasn't an accidental scratch or a minor cut. It was a catastrophic injury that required considerable force to inflict. Margot then collapsed, not dramatically, but with a desolate stillness that was perhaps more disturbing than any emotional outburst. He was going to destroy me, she whispered. Understand, Inspector, he was going to destroy everything. My marriage, my life, everything I've built. Explain yourself, Mallory ordered, though his voice softened slightly. Roland found out I'd been transferring money from the family investment account, Margot confessed. Her voice was barely audible. Small amounts, regularly. Money Victor doesn't need. Money that's actually under my control according to the terms of our prenuptial agreement. Where has he been transferring this money to? To a nursing home in Guildford. For my mother, Margot said, Victor doesn't know she's still alive. He thought she died years ago when we were just dating. But she didn't die. She's alive, and she's ill. Senile dementia. She needs constant care, which is very expensive. Mallory understood this. And why didn't he just tell Mr. Ashford it was for his mother? Because, Margot continued, her voice trembling, Roland had plans. He'd discovered I was financing the household, and he said that unless I gave him a substantial sum of money, he was going to reveal my mother's existence to Victor. He said he would use this as leverage to get Victor to invoke the infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement. Infidelity? Mallory asked. The caregiver at the nursing home, Margot explained bitterly. A kind man named Thomas. I've come to depend on him emotionally. It's not physical infidelity, but Victor's agreement is broad. Any emotional relationship he deems inappropriate can be invoked. And if he does, I lose everything. Not just the money, but access to any funds to care for my mother. She'd be sent to a state institution, Inspector. She'd be abandoned. Mallory leaned back. The motive, finally, became clear. Not rampant theft. Not embezzlement for personal gratification. Simply a desperate woman trying to care for a sick mother while trapped in a financially controlling marriage. And then he killed him. Not deliberately, Margot said, and this time the tears came, flowing in a silent river down her cheeks. He came to see me in the garden. He had followed Elizabeth, who had left the event. He thought there was something between Elizabeth and Victor. He wanted to use it as additional leverage. He told me he needed £10,000, or he would reveal everything about my mother, about Thomas, about everything. He said Victor would know within a week. And what happened then? I told him no, that he couldn't do that, that his blackmail was evil and that I wouldn't let him destroy my family, Margot said. He laughed. He just laughed at me. He said I was pathetic, that I deserved whatever happened to me. And something inside me, broke. Where was the gun? A garden rake. It was leaning against the wall near where we were. I just picked it up. And when he kept laughing, I hit him. I didn't think about it. I just acted. Mallory listened as Margot continued with the grim details of the crime. How she had struck Roland just once, hard enough to knock him down. How she had seen the blood and immediately realized the enormity of what she had done. How she had run to the house, taken off her blood-stained dress, tried to wash it, and then changed into another. "I never thought I'd kill him," Margot whispered. "I just wanted him to stop talking. I just wanted him to stop threatening me." When Mallory left the library, his career as an investigator had reached its usual conclusion. A crime solved, a criminal confessing. A town shocked but curiously satisfied that order had been restored. What Mallory didn't know was that Miss Marple, sitting in her small house in the village, had already woven the whole truth long before the confession was extracted. And when she learned the full story through the inevitable gossip of St. Mary Mead, she reflected not on Margot's guilt, but on the tragic circumstances that had led her to commit the act. A sick mother, a controlling husband, a desperate blackmailer, and a woman finally pushed past her breaking point. Miss Marple sighed as she sat down with her afternoon tea, knowing that justice, however true, was seldom simple. Chapter 9. The Consequences of Silence News of Margot. Ashford's confession spread through St. Mary Mead, with the characteristic speed of a small town where secrets never stay buried for long. Within 24 hours, every resident knew not only that Margot had killed Roland, but also the rough details of why. And, as inevitably happens in such cases, the public narrative differed considerably from the truth. For some, Margot was simply a murderous woman who had acted in a fit of passion. For others, she was a victim of circumstance, a desperate woman driven to an act of violence by the unbearable pressures of her life. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere uncomfortably between these two extremes. Victor Ashford had disappeared from the mansion just hours after his wife's confession. He had left for London, according to his secretary, without offering any explanation as to when he would return. The rooms he had occupied in the city were locked up. His colleagues at the bank where he worked were vaguely informed that he would be taking an extended leave of absence for personal reasons. Miss Marple, when asked by Widow Jenkins what she thought of the matter, offered her usual combination of compassion and clear observation. "Mr. Ashford is in a particularly difficult position," remarked Miss Marple as she poured tea. "His wife has certainly committed a terrible act, but the reason she felt compelled to act in this way lies, in a sense, on her own doorstep. A man who so completely controls his wife's finances that she must steal to care for her. Own mother is a man who has failed in his most basic marital duties. Are you suggesting that he's responsible for what happened?" asked Widow Jenkins, surprised. "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple gently corrected. "I'm simply observing that blame is seldom a matter of one person in such circumstances. Mr. Ashford disappeared because he knows he is partly responsible, though perhaps not entirely aware of it. Elizabeth Hartley, Paris's niece, remained at the manor, though she seemed increasingly out of place. She had been questioned by Inspector Mallory twice, her movements at the time of the crime verified as thoroughly as possible. She had been completely innocent of any involvement in the murder, though some in the village still harbored suspicions simply because she had been an outsider. What was interesting, though not publicly stated, was that Elizabeth didn't seem entirely surprised by the events. When Miss Marple met her at the village shop on Thursday, Elizabeth appeared more resigned than shocked. "Life is complicated," Elizabeth had said when Miss Marple expressed her sympathy for the family's troubled state. "Families are even more complicated. I hope Margot will find some peace eventually, although I doubt she'll find it anytime soon." "Did you know her well?" asked Miss Marple. "No," Elizabeth replied, "but I've seen enough of life to recognize when a woman is being suffocated by circumstances. It was obvious from the moment I arrived. The way she looked, the way she spoke, everything about her screamed that she was trapped." Miss Marple reflected on this. There were similarities between Elizabeth and herself, although Elizabeth was much younger. A certain clarity in observing human character, an acceptance that most people were doing the best they could under imperfect circumstances. "Will you be going back to France?" asked Miss Marple. "Soon," said Elizabeth. "There's no reason to remain here now, and Paris, despite its own problems, has always been more honest about human weaknesses than English people. Here, everything must appear respectable on the surface. It's exhausting." The formal investigation was completed in 2 weeks. Margot's confession, combined with the forensic evidence of the bloodstained dress and the entries in Roland Ashford's diary, provided a closed case. She was formally charged with premeditated murder. Although the lawyer Victor Ashford hired for her suggested he could argue for a verdict of manslaughter with mitigating circumstances, what happened in court was a matter of public record. Although Miss Marple did not attend the trial, such things depressed her, as they invariably proved that legal justice seldom achieved moral justice. Margot was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that parole be considered after 15 years. Given her age and the circumstances of the crime, it was a verdict that left most of St. Mary Mead feeling uncomfortably divided. Some believed she deserved more time. Others thought she should never have been prosecuted, that Roland Ashford had deserved what happened to him. Most were simply glad the matter was over. Victor Ashford returned to the manor once after Margot's conviction. Miss Marple saw him walking through the village one July afternoon, his face consumed by what appeared to be a mixture of guilt and relief. He paused outside the corner shop, but didn't go in. Instead, he turned and walked back to the manor without speaking to anyone. 2 days later, Ashford Manor was closed up. Sheets were placed over the furniture. The servants were dismissed, each with generous references and gratuity checks that suggested someone was trying to buy silence about the family's affairs. Mrs. Ashford, the matriarch, went to live with a younger sister in Sussex. The mansion remained empty for months, its windows dark like closed eyes, its gardens gradually neglected until weeds began to overtake the carefully cultivated flowers. St. Mary Mead, meanwhile, continued its orderly life. Shops opened and closed. Churches held their services. Afternoon teas were served in the homes of respectable ladies. Life went on with that quality of apparent timelessness that English villagers possessed, as if nothing as vulgar as a murder could permanently affect their tranquil routine. But those who observed carefully might have noticed subtle changes. Widow Jenkins was visiting a caretaker in Guildford regularly, bringing flowers and books for Margot Ashford's mother. Dr. Stevens had begun a quiet but persistent campaign to educate the women of the village about their financial rights in marriage, and Miss Marple, in her small village house, continued with her embroidery and her observations, knowing that crimes were merely outward manifestations of much deeper human truths. The real mystery of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple thought as she gazed out of her window at the rose garden, wasn't who had committed the crime. It was why it took so long for people to recognize that the silent suffering of their neighbors was as real as any other injustice, and that, sadly, was a truth that Miss Marple knew would never be completely resolved. Chapter 10. Reflections in the Twilight Autumn arrived in St. Mary Mead with its usual melancholic beauty. The leaves changed color, passing through shades of gold and crimson before falling onto the village paths and gardens. The evenings grew shorter, and a penetrating chill began to seep into the nooks and crannies of the old houses. It was the time of year that Miss Marple had always found reflective, conducive to contemplating the mysteries of human existence. She sat in her usual chair by the living room window, her embroidery resting in her lap, though her hands weren't weaving. Instead, she gazed out, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden. Inspector Mallory had visited that morning, not in an official capacity, but simply as someone seeking the advice of a woman whose wisdom seemed as old as the village itself. "I still don't fully understand how you knew," Mallory had said, sipping tea in the living room. "I had all the pieces right in front of me, but you saw the pattern when I didn't. The change of clothes, Roland's diary, the connection to the financial affairs. It all pointed clearly to Margot Ashford, but I was too focused on Victor. The jealousy seemed so obvious. Jealousy always seems obvious," Miss Marple had replied calmly, "because it's an emotion we understand, that we recognize. But money, Inspector, money is a much more subtle force. It's the true passion of our time, even though we pretend it's excitement, love, honor. But most crimes, if you examine them carefully enough, have money somewhere at their root." "And yet she didn't commit the crime for money," Mallory observed. "She committed the crime because she was trying to protect her mother." "Ah, but that's the interesting thing, isn't it?" asked Miss Marple. "Money is merely the means. The real motivation was love, or at least a form of it. Love for her mother, which made her vulnerable. Love for Thomas the caretaker, which made her brave. And perhaps, finally, a lack of love in her marriage, which made her desperate. All these things were intertwined, Inspector. Crimes are never about just one thing. There are always layers." Mallory had left after that, but his words stayed with Miss Marple. She knew the inspector was trying to come to terms with his own limitations as an investigator. He had solved the crime, certainly, but only because an elderly woman in a rural village had identified patterns he had overlooked. It was humiliating in its own way, though Miss Marple had always presented it with a delicacy that made the act almost invisible. What Miss Marple hadn't mentioned to Mallory was that there was an even deeper aspect to the case that remained unresolved, at least in the official records. For while Margot had confessed to the murder, and while the law was satisfied that justice had been served, Miss Marple knew that the real tragedy wasn't the act of violence itself, but the years of control and domination that preceded it. Victor Ashford had briefly returned to St. Mary Mead a week ago. Miss Marple had seen him at the railway station, talking quietly to a solicitor whose name she didn't know. Victor looked like a man who had been drained of all his vitality. His suit, which had once been immaculate, now seemed to hang on a thin frame. His eyes had the sunken look of someone who wasn't sleeping well. What Miss Marple learned, through the usual channels of information flowing through St. Mary Mead, was that Victor was considering ending his career in the city, that he had begun inquiring about the possibility of visiting his wife in prison, that, in a sense, the crime had destroyed both the perpetrator and the victim. This, Miss Marple thought, was the real lesson the English people so seldom learned. That guilt was not a binary proposition, that there were rarely clearly defined good and bad people, that most crimes were simply the culmination of years of petty betrayals, neglect, and failures of compassion, and that often, the clearest victims of a crime were not the person who had been murdered, but all those whose lives had been altered by the violent action that could not be undone. Margot's mother, for example. Miss Marple had made private inquiries and discovered that the woman was still in the nursing home in Guildford, her dementia progressing inexorably. She would never know exactly what had happened to her daughter. She would never understand why the visits had become infrequent, then stopped altogether, and Thomas, the caregiver with whom Margot had developed an emotional bond, had left the home a few weeks after Margot's arrest. Unable to bear the public scrutiny and speculation her name had generated, he had moved to Brighton, or so the rumours said, where he worked at a beach resort, far from the prying eyes of the rural villagers. Even Mrs. Ashford, the matriarch, had been transformed by the event. Miss Marple had seen her only once since moving to Sussex, on a brief visit to St. Mary Mead to settle some final business. She looked like a woman who had aged a decade in a matter of months. Her characteristic kindness had been replaced by a kind of bitter harshness, as if she had finally learned that compassion was not always reciprocated with gratitude. Miss Marple rose from her chair and went to her small private library. She took out a volume she hadn't consulted for years, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, who, as was well known, had been greatly inspired by observations of real cases. She leafed through the pages until she found the passage where Hercule Poirot reflected on the nature of guilt and criminality. Crime is a pathetic thing. Without glory, without magnificence, he remembered Poirot saying, "It is simply one man violating the laws of another." But that, Miss Marple thought as she closed the book, was where Poirot, brilliant as he was, fell short. Crime was never merely a violation of the law. It was a symptom of something much deeper, the breakdown of the bonds that held human beings together. It was the visible manifestation of the silent isolation in which almost everyone at St. Mary Mead lived, unknowingly. And that was the real crime Miss Marple had solved. Though she would never mention it to anyone, it wasn't discovering who had killed Roland Ashford, but recognizing that Roland Ashford had unwittingly exposed his family's true sickness, that no one really spoke up, no one really asked questions, no one really understood the pressures their loved ones were living under. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead and Miss Marple lit her lamps, against the gloom of the autumn evening, she reflected on how it was that a small town could appear so civilized, so respectable, so completely orderly, while just beneath the surface, people were living lives of quiet despair. It was a truth that Miss Marple had learned during 83 years of careful observation, and it was a truth that would probably never change. Chapter 11. The closure and its echoes. December arrived in St. Mary Mead with a bone-chilling cold. The snow fell in delicate flakes during the first week of the month, transforming the village into a picture-perfect Christmas postcard, though beneath that superficial beauty lay a disquiet that the festive decorations could not entirely conceal. Miss Marple watched from her window as the villagers went about their Christmas shopping with an energy that seemed forced, as if they insisted on maintaining traditions precisely because the social order had been so recently disrupted. Margot Ashford's trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier, and although the murder conviction was final, the talk in the village continued. In the corner shop, while buying tea and bread, Miss Marple overheard snippets of conversation that revealed how the public narrative was evolving. It was no longer simply the story of a woman who had committed a crime. It was becoming a more complex moral tale, one in which even those who did not excuse Margot's act were beginning to question the circumstances that had led to it. Widow Jenkins, who had visited Margot in prison after the sentencing, had remarked obliquely that the prisoner seemed to be at peace, an observation so laden with meaning that Miss Marple knew that Widow Jenkins believed Margot had found some degree of redemption, even if it was not the kind that legal justice offered. What was truly remarkable during those weeks in December was the emergence of a more fundamental change in the way St. Mary Mead dealt with its secrets. Dr. Stevens had opened an informal clinic in her home where the women of the village could come to discuss their marital and financial rights. At first, attendance was sparse, but gradually, week by week, more women began to appear. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors were now being aired, albeit still cautiously. In the semi-security of the doctor's office, Miss Marple was invited to one of these sessions by Dr. Stevens, an invitation she initially declined. But after some thought, she changed her mind and attended a meeting one freezing afternoon in mid-December. What she found was surprising. Approximately 12 women of varying ages were sitting in Dr. Stevens' living room, discussing remarkably openly topics that included financial control, psychological violence, and the revolutionary concept that women could have rights even within marriage. That's what drove Margot to despair, Mrs. Weatherby was saying, who had surprisingly become an active participant. She had no way out. Her money was under control. Her mother was in hiding. Her life was being completely run by her husband. When Roland Ashford threatened to expose her secrets, she simply broke. But does that justify her? Asked a younger woman named Iris, who worked as a secretary at the town hall. Does it justify her killing someone? It doesn't justify it, Dr. Stevens replied, but it explains it. And if we understand how these crimes happen, perhaps we can prevent them in the future. Perhaps we can ensure that fewer women find themselves in such desperate positions. Miss Marple listened without comment, though her eyes watched carefully. She noticed how the conversation flowed, how the women encouraged each other to share their own difficulties. One woman whose finances were completely controlled by her husband. Another whose career had been sabotaged because her husband disapproved of her. A third who had been, effectively, a prisoner in her own home for years. It was a revelation of St. Mary Mead that had not been visible from the surface. The investigation into the crime had been public and official, but this awakening of female consciousness was something much quieter, though potentially far more transformative. When Miss Marple finally spoke, it was in her usual measured tone. The interesting thing about St. Mary Mead, she began, is that we've been content to accept that life works a certain way, that men manage the finances, that women accept this as the natural order. But when you really look at how we live, you see that this arrangement isn't to anyone's advantage. It's not fair to women, obviously. But it's also detrimental to men, because it puts them in a position of power that they can't always handle wisely. Dr. Stevens nodded. Do you think Mr. Ashford knew what he was doing with his wife? I believe, Miss Marple replied carefully, that Mr. Ashford probably thought he was doing the right thing, that he was being a responsible husband. But responsibility without consultation, without understanding of the other person, is simply tyranny in disguise. And tyranny, as we have seen, eventually produces a reaction. Towards the end of December, Ashford Mansion remained closed, although there had been indications that it might be put up for sale in the new year. Victor Ashford had formally written to the authorities expressing his wish that his mother be removed from the mansion and that the property be liquidated. The letter had been sent from an address in Scotland, suggesting that he had sought to retire to a place where his name would be less well known, Elizabeth. Hartley had left for France in October, taking with her little more than the clothes on her back, but not before leaving a letter with the widow Jenkins to be delivered to Margot in prison. Miss Marple never learned exactly what the letter said, but the widow Jenkins had mentioned that Margot had wept upon receiving it. Not from sadness, but from a kind of recognition that someone had seen her, truly seen her in her suffering, on New Year's Eve. Miss Marple made herself some tea and sat down with her final embroidery, a small sampler she had been working on for months. It contained a verse from Shakespeare that had been embroidered by her grandmothers before her. The truth will not set you free, but at least it will help you understand why you are in prison. As she gazed at the words she had meticulously stitched onto the canvas, Miss Marple reflected on how the Roland Ashford case had become so much more than just a murder investigation. It had become a mirror in which St. Mary Mead could see, briefly, her own unresolved problems. And while it was likely that most of those problems would remain unresolved, that most women would continue to live under the carefully exercised control of their husbands, at least now there was a conversation. At least now there was an awareness that things could be different, that, thought Miss Marple, as the church tower clock struck midnight, taking St. Mary Mead into 1936, was perhaps the best that could be hoped for from any crime, that it might serve as a catalyst for at least some degree of change, however small and imperfect. The real mystery, ultimately, wasn't who had killed Roland Ashford. It was why it had taken murder for the town to see what had always been there, that the ordinary lives of ordinary people contained dramas and tragedies as profound as any mystery novel, and that true justice was rarely achieved in the courts, but in the slow and silent changes that occurred in the hearts and minds of those who were finally willing to look more deeply